Something I think you have all been talking about. So these ideas will come up in different topics as I present to you because they just completely overlay it. And I tried to pull it out into its own section and I found that I wasn't able to do that. So that will include things like species selection, and a variety of other things in terms of how you manage the pasture. And then I have a list of resources for you because there's no way we can do it all. People take months-long courses and years-long courses just in pastures. Here's an interesting map. I chose it. It comes to us from the American Carbon Registry. So in thinking about ecosystem services and being good land stewards, which I know is your focus in working with SWCD employees, this will look a little different than most of us are accustomed to. Everything that's green, as you can see, this kind of grayish green, says forest and shrublands. So we know most of people think of Oregon and our Douglas fir forest or our ponderosa pine forest down the Cascade Range, and they sequester a lot of carbon, but really on a per acre basis, our grasslands or pastures sequester more carbon when they're well managed, which means over long, long periods of time, decades long plant communities, and with deeply, deeply rooted plant species. So not cutting them, not ripping them up. So this is a different view. And here in this speckly bit of the Willamette Valley, we can see that we've got lots of cultivated crops, and Brandon will talk to you more about that, and then grassland and pasture. So really, in terms of our state, we are an important area for carbon sequestration for those of you who will consider long-term plant communities. If you're tilling the soil every year and pulling your plants up, then you're primarily carbon releasing, but you're growing food that we all need. Just some perspective. So what is pasture? It's a plant community, as I said, mostly grasses, but it's also forbs. So what are forbs? They're herbaceous, broad-leafed, non-woody, short stature plants. So basically everything not a grass, not a shrub, not a tree. That includes a lot of different species. All those things that we call flowers that are seasonal, bright, showy. And in the context of grazing animals, there are things like that might be legumes, and these are all from the pea family. Examples are alfalfa, bird's foot trefoil, and clovers. So I mentioned those because they're important as food or forage sources. They might be intentionally in the pasture or not. Clovers tend to creep in depending on your management, even if you did not seed them. Carrying on. Pastures can be native. That means they have endemic species. So the things growing there were historically there hundreds and thousands of years ago, but not very often. We humans have altered a great number of our pastures, particularly in Western North America. We brought a lot of European grass species westward with us in our colonization era of our country. We wanted things to look like they were in Europe or like they were in the Midwest. And so the grasses that we find growing in pastures in the Willamette Valley are predominantly non-native. That's not a problem if they're well managed, and we will find a few of our native species, but keep that in mind. It can still be a healthy, functioning ecosystem, but it's not necessarily native, unlike on the east side of the Cascades where native grasses and plants are more the focus. So west of the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, all of this has gone through a tremendous amount of transformation since the 1850s. And you have to go to Findlay or some of our wildlife reserves to actually find native grasses. And there's some restoration going on in oak savannas with some species, but they always have to use some of the European grasses just in order to get them to grow, because the landscapes are very altered through our agricultural practices. So now we have European or Mediterranean species that predominate. What is quality or a healthy pasture? And this is where I'm particularly here on the wet side or west side of Oregon. They have good function. That means they're holding their soil, they're retaining water, they're wildlife habitat, and they're also forage for livestock. So this is a tall order. We're expecting a lot out of these lands, and so we really need to be very purposeful in how we manage them. And that's why you're in this course. And then I just have to give you a little technical definition, because we in the English language are always drawing in so many different cultural traditions. Some people look to New Zealand for pasture management techniques. Australians publish a lot. South Africans publish in English. And of course, we're speaking English, American English. Sometimes our terms are quite different in how we use them. So in 2011, thank goodness for those of us who teach across cultures and across nations, this is a tremendous guide. If you're ever a kind of an academic nerd and you want to know about that, I can share this publication with Sarah, but it's a grassland and pastures guide that's meant to be international. It's phenomenal, and it's truly all continents but Antarctica. So a pasture is a place where indigenous forage for grazing or cutting is produced. Notice it says indigenous by these folks. So we actually have cultivated pasture that's not the native species. Forage is the emphasis. I want you to keep these different components in mind. So first, the physical, what's the texture of the soil? And that's basically how big are the particles? And I am sure by this point in this course, most of you have concluded that you have primarily a clay soil. Some of you might have silt if you're up in the foothills of the Cascades with the volcanic ash. We'll look at some pictures of that kind of stuff as we go along. So this might be in your soil maps, and you might just discover it with your own shovel. And then there are chemical properties. So like in all plant nutrition, we think about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and occasionally the sulfur, but gardeners, NPK, it rattles off their lips, right? Sulfur is in only a particular case. Then there are micronutrients like magnesium and boron that we think about. And then some of the metals that we don't want to have as much. We do have some iron and some copper, but something like arsenic, which may be in your soils and in your water, very common in volcanic soils, but in fact is toxic. Please have your water tested. A lot of people in the foothills of Marion County and Lynn County have arsenic in their water and don't know it. And it can be very, very damaging to your health. And it's not a contaminant. It's not necessary from an industrial process. It exists in volcanic soils. And you've got resources through Oregon State University Extension and the SWCDs to learn about your own water. Oops, I'm going backwards, excuse me. Physical, chemical, and then when those things are in order, then we can talk about test information about the chemistry of your soils, and you'll get some other information about the OM, organic matter. We have lots of acronyms, and the little stuff like insects and worms. And don't forget that, because if it is if your pasture is a biotic community, then what happens beneath your feet is really important also. That's not going to be the focus here, but think about all those tunnels, all those animals in there that decompose, that eat other pests, and that create water infiltration paths. So fascinating stuff. We're getting better as humans about thinking about the little things, but for a lot of our history, we've just ignored them. Physical stuff, soil is not dirt, but it is inorganic parent material, so perhaps volcanic or washed in. We have a lot of clays, but sand is larger texture. Looking at this map, and I'm gonna, maybe someone will nod or just shout out, I'll check the chat real quick. If this soil textural triangle is familiar, so small stuff, and we sit right here in a lot of places in our valley. If anybody, Evan's putting his thumb up. Cool, thanks, Evan. I love the feedback. It really helps me know. So if you're feeling, yes.
Oh, I was just gonna say, we did get a little bit of this in the soils class. It's good review though, okay. For sure.
Yeah, okay. So when you have a mix of textures, things are easier for you to deal with. But this is where, when land is less valuable for crops, it tends to be where we stuff the animals. So think about that. If you can afford to have a large piece of land that doesn't have high per acre value, and you're going to put your livestock there, take care of it, be wise. All right, I'll move through this more quickly. So soil moisture matters. Of course, that's a physical property, but it interacts with the biological stuff. Pores, holes, tunnels from all those rodents. And most of the rodents that we deal with are native. So this is a vole hole. Sorry to tell you that the healthier your grasses are, the more voles you're going to have. It's just an absolute direct correlation. Frustrating, people try to kill them, they're pests, but this is a big challenge, and people have raptor poles and all sorts of stuff. We want to know about organic matter, that's coming into the biology. But can we change the texture or the physical property? I'm just going to show you some management ideas that aren't necessarily what we will do where you're growing your plants, but if you've got livestock, you're going to face this. yes, you can change the texture of your soils. It requires a lot of material, a lot of addition. It's expensive. You have to add sand if you're clay like we are, which is why I use that example. So you're not going to go out in summer and dump a lot of sand and try to turn that into your soil. If you add amendments like wood chips or manure, that's different. That's the biology. But in some places, in heavy use areas, you're going to want to add some heavier textured things like, or larger size, like 1/4 inch minus gravel, for example. So here, I like this image. This is 3/4 inch minus, easy to purchase. This is what your driveway's got on it probably. And then this smaller stuff, which costs a little bit more, is really worth considering. Because what if you, I'll show you the next slides. What if you decide, but you're thinking long-term, maybe you'll sell the place in 20 or 30 years and somebody wants to grow something different. If you set the whole place up for animals, it may be hard to convert to a different use. So let's continue to focus on the texture. Every pasture has gates, fence lines with heavy traffic, whether it's you, your neighbors, the animals walking along there, your vehicles, and it starts to look like this, just a foul bog, particularly in Western Oregon. Go to Kentucky right now where it pours down rain just like it is here. Horses are turned out. They don't have mud because it's limestone. It drains really, really well. The animals are turned out. $500,000 animals are standing out in the rain on beautiful calcareous soils, but not in Western Oregon. Really wasn't designed for this. So you can see this is a heavy use area. It's full of, you know, pugging. It's a mess. This orange is just the usual small textured soil, but this landowner is going to add some texture, some gravel, so that it's less muddy around this very, very nice fence that is a mesh fence, very safe for any species of livestock. So here we go. Here's, this is some 3/4 inch minus. I prefer 1/4 inch, but that's because it doesn't get stuck in the hooves of horses in particular. It's a tiny bit more money. So add that on. Here's another muddy spot along an electric fence. This is suitable fence for a horse, for cattle, not for goats. They run right under that. And here you go. Maybe you have a small tractor and you're able to move that and put it in with a bucket. This is just a 16 horsepower tractor, so relatively small. Or you're going to rake it in because you're on a small scale and you're just getting that there in the wheelbarrow with you, and you know, use an aluminum rake and change that texture so it's easier for you to manage. In future, if you added 1/4 inch and you decided to change the whole scheme here and not have animal access, you could plant a crop that Brandon might talk to you about. So really think long-term, make it work for you, take care of the resources, but also think about, is it okay to drastically alter the purpose of your land if you're a tenant, if you have other purposes in mind, and that's only something only you know. So thinking about the water parts, this is now legal in Oregon. It wasn't for a very long time legal for us in this state to collect rainwater or gray water, and now it is. They were concerned that we would drink it and make ourselves ill. We've gotten beyond that. So here is a small pasture shed. This trough is just sitting here filled with rainwater, but you could do your own rainwater collection. That's why this is diverted in this fashion. There are joints in this downspout that can be removed with flexi pipe, and the trough would ordinarily sit here. Now it's just running off. Collection tanks are a really good idea if you're in a spot where you don't have, maybe you find that you do have arsenic and your rainwater is going to be a better option for you. And this one had to be raised because in order to get enough flow, it had to be raised up over ground level. This is only a 500-gallon tank. It might look pretty ominous, but it fills an hour rain on the surface area of this roof in just a couple days, which is remarkable. But you're going to need diversion. So this actually comes across, that's right here, goes into this tank. But when it's full, it would back up into the gutter. You don't want that. And so it just runs out onto the ground. So anyway, I just like to mention that that's not absolutely just about pasture, but there are a lot of ways to connect a roof line to providing water to the animals or to whatever crop you've got. Let's get into the chemical components of pasture. And Sarah mentioned this very wisely early in our session today. Absolutely use a lab test. A&L is only one example of a lab, but I have to give them credit. They have some of the best graphics in presenting the results. So this graphical analysis is not an Oregon soil, but the things that you want to focus on for pasture in particular would be organic matter, 0.5% would be disgraceful. If your soil only had half, that would mean that you don't have rotting, decaying roots and other biology down in your soil. And you try to get below the root matter and only collect the textural, the physical part of the soil, but there's still some living things in there. So we like to have 5% organic matter in a really healthy long-term pasture. Nitrogen is important, although it is the least reliable measure in a lab test. I'll talk about that in a moment. This particular location has extremely low pH. If you've got 4.8 pH, it may be a naturally leached location, but you're going to need to adjust that if you want to grow most of the crops that are part of pasture. Lots of you can learn about a lot of the minerals, but I just wanted to mention these 3 as important pieces for pastures in particular. And there's lots to this beyond what I'm saying here. So let's focus on Western Oregon and typical challenges that we find related to the chemistry, but certainly don't just assume, oh, well, here I am, I'm in the Willamette Valley. She said it, I'm in the slopes of the Cascades. Be sure to test your own location. So there's a lot of information in this table. Let me try to go through it nice and piecewise. I'm telling you that most likely you're going to have low pH, and I'm willing to put some money on that. We can see what Brandon has to say next. So it's acidic, it's lower than 7, but it's natural. It's not that it has been poorly managed. The parent material, what it was made from initially, may be volcanic, it's weathered. And also we have lots of pine, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, which is in the pine family. And so those plants decompose and add acids. We often have soils that are between 5 and 6 pH. The benefit of changing the pH of your soil from high 5s into mid 6s for pasture is phenomenal. So a little bit of investment in material like lime, whether that's powdered lime or from a bag, can yield tremendous result. It helps the grasses and the forbs that you're growing. 2 options generally, something called agricultural lime. You'll see this in summer on a dry day, large vehicles out spreading lime. It's very dusty and blows away, and farmers pay for that service. If you're a large scale farm, you might do that. Generally, that's calcium carbonate. You need to wear masks so you don't inhale it and take care of yourself. It can kind of burn. If you're smaller scale or you can afford it because it's worth the input, you might consider Dolomitic lime. That also has magnesium, which may be needed, depends on the soil test. Or you took a plant tissue test. So you harvested your plants, you dried it out a bit, you sent it off to a lab, and that revealed to you not only what your soil has got going on, but are the plants taking up the nutrients that are under their feet, their roots. So personally, I pay for the Dolomitic lime, but I manage small scale pastures just by nature of what I do. I don't have big hundreds or thousands of acre pieces. So this is a choice for you to make about cost of inputs. Low nitrogen is very, very common also in our Western Oregon soils. That's due to rain leaching. It just moves nitrogen through the soil layers. It's a natural process. Depends on the land use and precipitation. Commonly, people decide to add fertilizer. They pour that into a large buggy and put it on. But for you, if you have livestock, I want you to think, what are my on-farm resources? Do not pay for nitrogen if you've got piles of manure. You have an on-farm resource. It needs to be composted well, but generally the use of manure is a tremendous asset, and use that recycling of on your own land. And I'm worried about the time. I could go on forever. Sarah will give me a prompt if I'm really blowing it time-wise. So you're going to get the nitrogen level in your soil test, but they vary widely. In fact, talking with my other pasture colleagues and those who test soils frequently, I'm told that the nitrogen levels in soil tests within the same lab and from lab to lab are the least reliable. So one of the most important nutrients in plant growth, we know the least about. We might think, oh my gosh, it's terribly low or terribly high. If you go take that test the next week, it may be vastly different. So I would say in general, focus on pH more, and don't panic about your nitrogen because it may in fact not be very reliable. And here's just kind of a common everyday wisdom. Keep your eye open. If you're observing you're looking across a pasture, and anybody have seen this, a darker, richer, bluer green spot a few feet across, it's a urine spot. Sometimes it's a manure spot. But what's happened, urine is very, very high in nitrogen, and those plants are thrilled to have that dose of liquid nitrogen on them. They take that up, and so those urine spots indicate higher nitrogen, and that's just a common sense indicator that, oh, my pasture would really benefit from some more widespread nitrogen. You're not going to get the animals to pee everywhere evenly, so you're going to have to do some managing. Sulfur is a touchy one. Only if you're trying to feed clovers should you add sulfur, in my general opinion, for pastures, and certainly not for horse pasture, because we aren't encouraging clover in the pastures of horses due to their digestive system. Consider the desired plant community if you need sulfur. So we have lots and lots of clover farmers in Western Oregon. That's their main deal. They're growing seed to export all over the world. They're quite famous for growing really good quality clovers. So they'll add lots of sulfur if that's their primary crop, but not so much to pasture. They're just using the natural animals. Like, oh, and this should be species, excuse me. So it depends on the mix of species that you're feeding, the grass, the plants, and the livestock species. All right, moving on. So focusing on the lime, this is a this is a brand name I recognize, but it's a common one. This is an expensive kind of lime to purchase. Comes in a bag. I think these are 50-pound bags sold at many of our ag supply companies, but it's manageable if you are going to be amending 2, 5, 10, 20 acres. It contains the magnesium that I mentioned, which is very important in the diets of livestock. And this is not dusty. This is a really nice pelletized, easy to fling out in a broadcast piece of equipment, easier for you to manage. And you don't have to worry about your eyes or your lungs. You don't have to wear a mask. It's really easy to apply. For those of you to whom organic production is appealing, it's OMRI labeled. So that means that it comes from a source, it can be mined, but it doesn't have a petrochemical in it. And so generally, a very high value product, you're gonna have to decide if you have the financial resources across your area to use that. Just want to show you an example. Okay, let's move into the biological components. Your pasture is a plant community, and hopefully, if you've done a good job, it has species and cultivars that have different maturation times, so throughout the whole year. Seed companies generally have made the mixes for you. Just read the label. Things have to be labeled in this country. Thank goodness, what a benefit that is. And in Oregon in particular, the label will tell you the percent, and I'm going to show you some examples, and it'll tell you the percent noxious weeds as well. Get it close to 0 because we don't want to intentionally put seed on that we don't want. Customized mixes, some people like that idea of making something just for them. They're very costly though. And if you're a small acreage farmer, it really isn't going to be practical for a large seed company to do a mix for you generally. The batches of seed come in hundreds of bags, and those bags generally weigh 50 pounds. So have confidence in what they've made for you, and you might choose the best mix, and then monitor what grows well, and then overseed if you wish to adjust something. So you might want to go back and add a single seeded species into your bare spots after you've dealt with your voles and your moles and your gophers or something of that sort. Here are some examples. I don't know what species of livestock any of you are raising or what you're dreaming of raising in the future, so I tried to just take a little sampling. And notice that these are seed mixes for the Pacific Northwest, and it is regionally different. I'll get to that as well. So this one is suggested for beef cattle. So these are going to be growing animals. We want them to put on a lot of muscle, some bone to go with that. And those mama cows are going to need to produce some milk for their calves. So meadow brome is a large portion of the mix, orchard grass, which is just delicious to all of our livestock. And we grow a huge portion of the world's orchard grass right here in the Willamette Valley. A perennial rye as a large portion, 10% white clover. Immediately that should say to you, this is not a horse pasture mix, and 5% alfalfa. So these two are in the pea family, the legumes. This is putting some protein in. Orchard grass, actually, as grass goes, is pretty darn good for protein. They're going to mature at different times. They have different heights. Orchard grass, very deeply rooted. So there's benefits to each of these species in terms of when they mature, how they occupy the soil layer. There's a lot to that, a lot of purposeful thought. Looking over here to the sheep, notice that we've got, Kentucky bluegrass, which is very, very fine. People in the Midwest are trying to get rid of it. They think of it as pest garbage, but we don't here because we have hot summers and we're just happy to have that. A lot of orchard grass, again, some perennial rye, and lots of the forbs. But sheep are intermediate feeders. They like to eat grass. They like to eat a few little forb species that we call them intermediate feeders. They're curious little critters. This is a really good one for them. Some white clover. They can cope with these legumes in their diet. And then chicory, which, be careful. In a lot of places, it's considered a weed, but we're real experimenters here in Western Oregon. And so this actually has some health benefits, might kill worms in the gut. And that tells it, it's a little bitter to the taste, but sheep like it. On to horses. I don't know how many of you are horse people. I have a lot of horse clients. As I said, no clover. Look at how very different this is. This is specific orchard grass and annual rye, because horses rip stuff up. They're heavy, they have tougher hooves. And so we have a grass that's going to reseed itself at a large portion of the mix, 20%. A tall fescue, 20%, another perennial. So notice all these grasses as the largest portion of the mix. No clovers, no trefoils or any of those. The horses, once they're grown up, do not need the extra protein. And in fact, the gut doesn't manage the gaseous byproducts of the clover. And in this case, this example that I took, this one, inner weed are these percentages. So they're telling you that 3% of the bag has some other stuff in it that's not going to grow. And then it's less than 1% weed. So that's actually pretty good. It's honest. Not all states require that kind of labeling, but in our state, we're pretty strict from what I understand about that. Here's the orchard grass. If you are a native plants person, if you're working with Native Plant Society or a restoration location, you're not going to want this. You're not going to want it at all. It grows really well. It's deeply rooted. It persists. It's highly palatable. For those of us with livestock, we love it. But it takes over and it's not native. So really think about your purpose. And so if you have a neighbor who's doing the native species thing, be honest and think about your shared fence line. It survives in drier locations due to deeper rooted, tolerates shading. It's a great grass to grow, and this is how you might identify it. I better move on. We also grow Timothy. We don't plant it. We can put it in pastures, but it's so delicious they eat it out. So it's usually cut for hay. We do have Timothy hay growers in our state. It looks like this when it's in anthesis. If you have a really wet, boggy pasture, I think a gentleman in this workshop has a wet spot. And so he's going to have to think about that. It's going to stay wet. If that's the way it is, if it's level, if it just, has a lot of drainage, accept that and think, what's the best use for a wet place? This is a plant that you might have in your wet spot. Meadow Fox Tail looks a lot like the Timothy because of its shape, but it's taller, it's a little purplish. And in some places in Western Oregon, this is the best you can do and accept it. It's on wet spots. People don't generally intentionally plant it, but good farmers, people raising livestock say, hey, that's my Meadow Foxtail pasture. You're going to see this in April and May. And they say, that's the best that grows there. And they deal with it. Matures early. Tall fescue is across the country. You may have heard concerns because it has an endophyte in it. So we also grow tall fescue for your lawn because we trample all over it. It has endophyte in it. For forages, it's selected very, very specially to not have that. Very common. Sequesters nitrogen well if you happen to be in a spot where you do have nitrogen problems. There are those places. Perennial rye is another common one. And I'll move through these a little more quickly because I'm doing them individually just to get you a sense of all the variety that's out there. But again, they're all growing side by side and throughout the whole plant community. This is a gentleman who works at one of our seed companies here in Oregon where they have all these test plots. We live in a terrific place for all this. If you want to get connected, I can help you with that. So they bred these, we have an Italian rye crossed with the meadow fescue and they select these for certain spots and export them all over the world. So we're, tremendous ideas. This is a wheat crossed with a rye. triticale. And so this is very useful. People like to feed this to feeder cattle, and it's also used in poultry diets. So you might be thinking about the little critters on your farm. Alfalfa is important, great source of nutrients, but often overfed, particularly to horses. We have a lot of research here, and we have two alfalfa specialists in our state. This is an old date on 2015, but you might jot this down. This is Central Oregon Ag Research Center, and our alfalfa research is done over there. This is something that most of you, particularly if you move south in the Willamette Valley, you're going to find black medic. It's in a lot of pastures. It's pretty tough. And again, it puts protein early in the year. Can be invasive though. Again, if you're wanting your natives, it'll make trip hazards. It grows just everywhere. It can take over. Here are a couple different clovers that we have that are common. This one grows across the ground. That's the stoloniferous component. And this is something you're going to see in your lawn all over the place. It'll show up if you don't even purposefully plant it. Notice I'm starting to show you the clovers. I hope you're seeing all these blossoms. And if you've been talking with your conservation thinkers, one thing that we've done very poorly in pastures historically is try to make them all grasses, knowing that that's good for the animals, but think pollinators, whether those are birds, bees, whatever insects they might be. Everyone in agriculture, no matter woodlands managers, backyard gardeners, we must all be thinking about our pollinators. And it was said to me so very powerfully by an entomologist friend of mine. She's now in Minnesota. She said, she leaned into me one day and she said, Claudia, without pollinators, we have no vitamins. And I had to pause, sometimes these really simple statements. Every blossom, every fruit, all of the rich parts of our human diet that bring us vitamins, which help us use all the other nutrients, rely on a pollinating animal. Every last one of them. Fruits, vegetables, our legumes, pulses, all of it. So even if you think, oh, I want a sea of grass, it's beautiful. Within that sea of grass are going to be these other forbs that have rich flowers. And you and I need to do that. So there you go, a little bit of philosophy. And our seed companies in Oregon are on board. They get it. And so they're becoming more ecologically minded. And this brings us to one of these climate resiliency questions about taking care of those pollinators that have suffered due to changes in climate or disease that our bees are experiencing due to imports of other species. So I had to make that point about the little critters that are eating your pasture are probably in the long term for our species of humans, even more important than us short term feeding our livestock. This is a really exciting, yeah.
I just wanted to let you know. So we have you down just for a few more minutes, but we can extend that a little bit because this is good. So we have a little bit of time that we can take later in the day.
Okay, good. Thank you for prompting me. I know because I could go on and on because I love my stuff. I'm going to move quickly through these and then you can bring me back if you have questions. How about that? So lots of these beautiful, think about some of their components. Bird's foot trefoil is another interesting one. Here's the chicory, weedy. I don't like to see it actually, but I'm a weeds person. I'm trying to get rid of weeds, but a lot of experimentation with this plant now in Oregon. Kale, we have some important kale growers. The brassicas are their mustards. Most of us find these to be weeds, but they're seasonally growing well, and they help us with climate resiliency. So, okay, let me watch what you find. You may do a web search looking for a warm or cool season grass. These descriptors are of the grasses. And in Oregon, we have primarily warm season grasses. Excuse me, cool. That means they do best when the soil is in this temperature range and the air is 60 to 75. And then we get that summer slump. July, it dries out, it gets warm. We feel like we love it, but it's tough on the grass and they start to brown out. They don't have that issue in the Midwest and the upper plains because they have warm season grasses. They have different physiology. And you might read something that says to you, the most commercially available grasses are warm season. But this clip that I took is from a Midwestern website. And in fact, here in Oregon, both east and west side, we are primarily growing cool season grasses. This is changing. We're experimenting with some of these other things from other regions because if we have enough summer moisture, these plants can tolerate the heat that we're experiencing. And we know that our summers are much hotter than they were compared to our long-term average. That's an interesting point. This is a complex topic. I'll just leave it there to spark your thought about the kinds of species that we're choosing to use. Here's the big dilemma for us in all of Oregon, wet or dry side. This is what's going on in your pasture right now. We're here between winter and spring. And some people, you might think, well, I can turn my animals out if I have a little bit of growth, a few sunny days in January, we get sprout coming up. But be very, very careful, because you're not just growing above ground, you're growing your roots. And as we get longer day length here in spring, notice schematically the roots are growing to take care of your biotic part of your soil. So we get all this growth above ground and below ground, both are essential. It gets warmer but drier, and then we get this summer slump. In the Midwest, the curve is opposite. They get lots of growth here, they still have rain. We do not. So this seasonality is essential to understanding your pasture. We get a lot of that good fall growth, but then it's muddy and mucky, and we're gonna rip it up with our animals. So keep this seasonality of growth in mind, essential. Okay, oh, let me go back a moment. All right, so this illustrates that. This is our average rainfall, the average precip for Portland, close enough, throughout the year. And the opposite curve represents when things grow, right? Summer, May, June, July, long day length. So right here, just as we're getting the solar radiation that we know our plants need and want, they're opening their little solar collector leaves, they're losing moisture. Balancing this, managing your soil well to hold the moisture is your job as a pasture manager to deal with this conundrum. I just had to throw this in, be prepared for snow. This is about anywhere. Make sure you have freeze-free faucets. Need to be at least 2 foot down in our climate. And be prepared to send in an electric coil. Maybe you have a solar heater or something to animals drink more when the water is above freezing. Stock tank de-icer is well worth your investment. Keep the cords away from the animals, of course, so they don't chew on them. They're curious minds. This is something some people think is just a luxury, but let me tell you why it's really important to keep the water warm, and not just the ice cracked off, but warmer than that. In cold weather, your animals need as much or more than they do on our hottest days between 90 and 100 Fahrenheit. Why? It's cold. They're standing, they're not moving around as much, they're not losing it through sweating or through panting. The metabolic energy to shiver and to keep them warm, to keep they're not wearing a coat, most of them, consumes an enormous amount of water. So winter dehydration is a serious issue, puts horses in a very, very bad spot. In particular, thirsty animals don't eat. So you've got a double whammy. They don't eat adequately, they lose weight, they're thirsty, they get wicked headaches, they feel like lousy, and you might lose them. Their gut motility changes, their digestion slows down, and especially in horses, you can get colic. So animals need slightly warmed water to do well, especially in the coldest of days. To have climate resiliency, think about your species and cultivar diversity. More diversity is better. Those warmer season grasses. How are you stocking your pastures? How many animals? And this is very site specific, but I'll give you what vocabulary to think about. Do your animals match your land? If you naturally have a lot of clovers in your pasture and you don't want to be out there spraying or killing off something, then have some sheep. Don't raise horses if you have that kind of flexibility in mind. Protect your soil as you nourish your livestock. These are overall ideas for you. Pasture is a habitat. And our climate trend in the Pacific Northwest is this. In general, our climate is warming and we're having drier summers. Our winters are highly unpredictable. We are having some dry winters and some wetter than average. I mean, it's just highly variable. But certainly our summers overall are dry, and we go 90 days without precipitation some summers. That's a long time for a thirsty plant. And I hear people say, oh, I love it. I love these drier, hotter summers. And I just cringe inside. I'm like, great. I love the desert too, but this is not normal for here, not usual. And there we go, warmer and more variable winters. And if we get snow, great. You know, we used to get snow often in the winter. We don't as much anymore. Pasture should be a mix of plants, but not weeds. Some people like their radishes. They're really good to feed to some animals. So this is a lousy pasture. This is a mess. Tansy ragwort. Look at this fence line contrast. Probably there's sheep over here. Some animals can tolerate it, other species can't. So here's my set of resources for you. So let me go through these, make some suggestions, and then wrap up. Thanks, Sarah, for being patient with me. So Oregon State University, all of our land grants have state and region specific guides. So here you go. You probably have already seen these, but just to mention, catalog.extension.Oregon State. And I know you work with some of those folks in the Small Farms program. So managing your soil pH, there's a publication that's very useful for you. A Google search would pull that up, and they're working very hard to revise all of these. So many have been updated. Here's manure application rates. That may be very important for you. How do you know how much to apply? Doing some calculations. So taking care of the soil, putting some nutrients in. This is a really interesting publication, a combination of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington thinkers. I have hard copy, I'm thrilled, but here you go. You can get this pasture and grazing management in the Pacific Northwest. Google that and find it about many of those species I talked about, taking good care of your pasture. So this is the overall guide, and it's really very valuable. And then if you want to know about a specific species, you're curious of anything, tree, plant, this USDA plants database, your tax dollars at work, tells you where weedy things are, where you would find them. So these are nice pair of resources for no matter what you end up doing with your land. This database is useful. You got to think about toxic plants. Just keep that in mind. They're different in the West and the East, and it depends on the species. And then I mentioned I have to put this plug in for my own particular interest of ecology and grazing together. Targeted grazing is a very particular application of grazing. And if you're just a curious person and you have lots of time on your hands, please join us. I'm the chair of the Targeted Grazing Committee at present for the Society for Range Management. Our virtual meeting begins next week. So just Google that, think about joining us. We have a committee meeting and we're having a symposium on February 15th with people from the Northwest, Tennessee, Saskatchewan, all over the country. It's fascinating. This is a really interesting community of very innovative people. And one more, I'm going to stop. So that's me. It's me with a cute little calf. I like all the little big and little critters. And I appreciate your attention, everyone. Let me mute myself and listen for a question.
Thank you, Claudia. That was excellent. We do have a couple people asking some questions. So one of them are asking about native grasses for oak woodlands, for folks that are restoring oak woodlands and folks that might be grazing in their oak woodlands.
Some of our native species of grasses include, I'm going to give you the scientific name, sorry, because some of them, I don't know the common names, but, and I can look at the chat, but Deschampsia cespitosa is in Eastern and Western Oregon. You will find seed supply of that. And let me find the chat.
I think that's slender hair grass, is that right?
It could be. I'm going to stop where I don't know. You can tell I have a bit of an academic background. That one you will find, and I'm typing in the chat, and I don't like misspelling, but I'm not such a good typist, so my eyes are tired.
Tufted hair grass,
that sounds better to me.
Call it.
So Deschampsia, people will call it that. You will find seed stock. We also have at upper elevations in the Cascades and moving into the east side, Idaho fescue. It's not likely to grow well on your ground, but those two are common natives. The other one that our NRCS native plant specialist is Danthonia. I'm not going to remember. It's called California oatgrass. I think maybe Brandon would bail me out. It's hard to get to grow in a lot of sites. So for the plant specialist, and there's one in the state of Oregon, and she's brilliant, and she's just Kathy Pendergrass. Your federal dollars at work in a very positive way. She's the only plant material specialist for the whole state. And it's just really, really hard to get our native grasses to grow because we've altered soil texture, chemistry, all of it. So they compromise. They're pragmatic, restoration biologists are, when they have to be, and they're going to mix in the fescues and the things that are from other regions or perhaps European grasses just to get the soil holding, the water retention. But they dream of having more resources, and their plant breeders working on this all the time at the Corvallis Plant Material Center. And, but it's hard work. And so I would encourage you to be pragmatic. I didn't like that message when I was taught that I want natives, you know, but this is a very altered landscape. It's intensely agriculturally used, and we humans have made change. But I can take you to some native pastures other places if you like on a field trip one day.
So I think there are also a lot of native broadleafs that would mix well with your native grasses that might be
absolutely
easier.
The flowering, we're much, much better with the forbs. And Jenny Meisel at Marion SWCD is fantastic. You have got an in-house resource, and rely on her. You've got a walking treasure in her. So yes, the forbs, the flowering.
And she's the one that spoke to us about vegetation a couple of weeks back. So
good. Yes, I would think you would draw on her.
So we have someone mentioning that Bruce Campbell's publication is a good resource. Yeah. Bruce Campbell, okay. Restoring Rare Native Habitats in the Willamette Valley. And someone else mentions that tufted hairgrass can dominate a site.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to work to get the forbs established first.
That would be interesting to go back and seed in that. That would be a chat. That would be interesting. So, you know, that's why I say it's really important to know what are your objectives for your land. I'm sure you've been working on this, because if you want just natives it's noble, go for it and develop in those connections to those resources, because their focus is often away from pasture, because, you know, pastures are heavily used. The hoof action, the herbivory is demanding on the land. So it can be hard to accomplish both of those goals simultaneously, but there are those who try for sure. But it's just being, you know, quite frank about that challenge. Our elk and other critters we're not using, they move away seasonally. We keep our cattle, our sheep, our goats present for longer seasons in one spot. Does anybody else have a particular question? I know we have another speaker, so I want to